moves, but something had to not move at the beginning to move everything else. And there's sort of a parallel with what you're saying here about in the beginning or before there was a beginning. And so John, in what, 90 AD, whenever he wrote his book,
Yep.
right?
Late 90s.
He's not necessarily preaching to just the Christians. He's still preaching to a overwhelming majority pagan population around him. In Greek-speaking areas of the Roman Empire, that probably know a lot of this Aristotelian philosophy. At least it's been passed down. I'm just trying to put things in a sort of cultural and historical context, because often we are so enlightened today. How could they not have known A, B, and C in 50 and 100 AD?
Well, that's kind of my point, which I like, because we have, sometimes, because we have this 2,000 years, sometimes we think we fall into, like, I'm just going to beat you over the head with the knowledge you should have. And that's not how it works. No one comes to faith because of rational argument. They come to faith mainly because the beauty of Christ is shining through someone or something somehow to them.
But can I ask a question then? And if this is a little too on the historical side, outside of our purview, forgive me. But so you have the three, what do you call it, synoptic gospels?
Yes.
And then there's John.
Right.
Which is more theological. But do we have an understanding of what drove him to write a theological book as opposed to the semi-biographical or semi-historical synoptic gospels? And do the fathers consider him simply enlightened with that understanding, or was there a background that he derived from to write in the Logos and all of that?
I'll answer as best I can in a minute, but John, I think you had a response to that?
Well, biblical scholars have talked about many different interpretations. Now, in part, he may have not repeated the issue of the birth of Christ, because it was already done.
Right.
And those gospels before. I think it is hard to explain, though, in terms of he may have had a kind of different understanding, a different type of spiritual understanding. And he's also presenting, you've often made this comment about, there are so many different biographies of Abraham Lincoln. Well, it's presenting a different kind of emphasis on Jesus, a different kind of portrayal of him in that regard.
But my question
he's also writing to, good.
But my question is this John's theological understanding, just 6 decades after Christ's resurrection, or was there already a church movement with all of this theology that he put into writing?
Both.
Well, it's both, but I think, though, given the sort of, shall we say, lateness of when it was written, I'm not a biblical scholar, but I've heard scholars say it may even be later than 90 AD, maybe early 2nd century or so. But there already was, by then, an established Christian community. And I think John is writing, yes, he may be concerned with some pagans, but I think more so than the other Gospels, he's really writing for a Christian community at that time.
And he's writing, so the scholars that I'm aware of have pointed out he was aware of the other writings and was not necessarily repeating things that were already there. And he also, because of what, again, my understanding is incomplete on this, so you guys could probably do some research and find out, but also what he was encountering. Remember, he was exiled and there were still persecutions going on, and as we see from the front to the back of the Bible, wherever truth is introduced, there's always immediate misunderstanding and misapplication. And John was the disciple whom Jesus loved, not because Jesus favored him above the others, but the church fathers understood that John had the most in-depth understanding of Christ. That's why he's given the title John the Theologian. Gregory's the other one, and Saint Simeon. They're the only 3 saints that are given the title theologian. And theologian is, the simple definition of theologian is someone who prays, right? So it's not always about this knowledge, it's about this noetic knowledge. And John had that. That's why actually when if I'm remembering this correctly, in the early church in catechesis, when they were finally became members of the church at Pascha, they weren't taught or exposed to John prior to that, because John was so in depth. Father George down at St. Nicholas has often said that it takes about 3 years of intense study and prayer to really get the Gospel of John. And my own experience has been that's true. And even to this,
Three.
Yeah.
I've been teaching for 25 years, and I've been at this for more than 30. And it's funny because at this stage of life, I'm like, why am I teaching? I'm much more conscious of what I don't know than what I know. Right? There's almost like it almost feels foolish to some extent. But yeah. So John is, and by the way, John probably, the chronology in John of events is the chronology the church uses more than the other three, because no one was hung up back then with getting the right order of events and all that. Everything was, the gospel writers were putting things in place for reasons. That's why sometimes you probably heard, you've heard the term bracketing. When you're reading a gospel, read what's right before and right after it to help enlighten. That's because, again, this level of intertwining, it starts at that level, but it goes on and on. So anyway, that's what, good.
So just a couple of thoughts. One is to John's point, we're putting this kind of 21st century view looking back.
Yeah, which is dangerous.
So when you start looking at Acts and everything else, a lot of those letters are struggles for the apostles to try and get all these different communities, right? No mass media or nothing. There's a group here and there's a group there, and they're trying to visit that one. And the next thing that happens, somebody comes along and starts talking something that isn't really the truth, and they're correcting things. I mean, we see this all the time. So, and then I'm going to put that on top of the other piece, which is most history, most everything that people communicated with was verbal, right? You told stories. It was a verbal world. And people weren't writing down. Most people didn't know how to read or write or any of that. Somebody told me a long time ago that when you go to the Orthos, that was the way that the uneducated or those who could read would learn about the church, because that's where you would learn it, through the Orthos. And so you got to put that context on top of all the other piece, which is you've got all these different communities, and we don't really have a printed Bible, right? I mean, the Bible's what? A bunch of collections of writings. I'm not saying they're not holy or inspired. I'm just saying, and we canonize them. It's kind of a growth period, but it's kind of, what's the word I'm trying to looking for?
Spontaneous.
What?
Spontaneous.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's not in this more 2,000 years of formulated down into a doctrine, and think of all the councils of Nicaea. I mean, all this other stuff just to try and forge this into, what we take for granted today. So you go back, I mean, those were probably heady times, but, a lot of it was foundational,
Well, and we have to be careful too about the imposing today back then for a couple of reasons. You said a few things. So yes, it's true. Literacy rates really weren't high until middle or early 19th century or whatever. But it's clear. Good morning, Father Peter.
I want to interrupt. I just want to say good morning.
Our Pros Dominus is coming in. Say hello.
Hello to the folks in the online world. Thank you.
Thank you, Father.
God bless you. What? We need a fan in here? Or you
We just got the air doesn't work really good in here, so But
God bless you all. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you for stopping in.
Absolutely. Actually, I'm going to go take my
That was a nice surprise. But if you read the Holy Father, especially John Chrysostom, it is clear he expects you to know the scriptures. So you have to know it somehow. So yes, there may not have been literacy rates, but there was more reading than people think. We tend to think they were all ignorant of reading, but the
and he's also 4th century.
Right. Yeah. So it's later on, but I'm saying you expect that by that time, most of the books are they're in place. They were in place by one rough, depending on, different scholars say different things, but around 150 AD, the canons it was in place for the most part, with the exception of Revelation, which came later. Most of it was already in place, and so they were being read and preached. Right, today it's a little bit different, and that's the other thing. It's you said something about the spermatozoa, or the spermatozoa. I got to be careful how I say this because I can easily be misunderstood.
Get yourself in trouble.
Yeah. Ancients, Orthodox Christianity, the truth, right? Orthodox Christianity, we believe, obviously, is the truth of Christ, right? God is not bound by the church. He works through the church. So the things that we sometimes place so much importance on, when we say the church is unchanging, plenty of things have changed while the truth has never changed. And so we can get married to practices and whatever and think this is what makes us the Orthodox Christian, and just not true. One thing you see it clear in the Bible, we talk about the Old Testament, sometimes the emphasis we place on ethnicity is so wrongheaded. Even back in the Old Testament, when we made a Jew wasn't bloodline. It was the practice, right? So the Israelites, it wasn't bloodline. It was what they chose to practice, how they worship Yahweh. It was based on that, not ethnicity. And so, we as human beings tend to sometimes reduce, it's about these practices only, or this ethnicity only, or this thing only. And God's bigger and greater than all of that. And that's why part of the challenge and purpose of looking at the Old Testament and Christ in the Old Testament, it also forces us to kind of broaden our mindset and broaden our understanding, to look at words on the page that can be opaque or even seem contradictory to us. But yet, as I said in the last class, knowing that the Holy Fathers operated looking at the scriptures based on Christ himself, that God is love. And how do we see and understand God in these pages? Because Christ gave us these scriptures. So that helpful at all? Hurt your head? Hurts mine quite a bit as I think about through this stuff. But yeah. So anyway, before I continue, are there any other questions or comments on any of these threads? And by the way, those listening in, we had some technical difficulties, by the way. So we kind of got started. You didn't see them, but I did. We got started midstream. Sometimes when we go off on these subjects, I don't think of them as tangents, because to me, they all seem to relate. If something I think is a true tangent, I'll try to pull it back. But one of the beauties of having a setup like this is the dialogue is where it goes. And I try my best as a facilitator to try to discern, is it useful to continue down a thread versus cutting it off? Because I don't think it's useful for me to impose a lecture as much as introduce thoughts, concepts, and ideas, and then see where we're taking them. So, but getting back to what we were, talking about, how Scripture is intertwined. I guess we probably won't get to the theophany part until later. So this is going to sound like a tangential question. Anybody remember the books of the Bible we read during the weekday in Great Lent?
Psalms and Proverbs.
Okay, well, yeah, Proverbs is one. Isaiah and Genesis. Okay, and so I bring that up because aside from Genesis and John, where is another very famous and controversial passage about creation? Very much like you read in Genesis 1 and John 1. So I gave you a hint by picking those three books. Giving you a softball.
Must be Isaiah.
Nope, wrong.
Oh, what's the hint then?
Too late. Well, I brought up three books. You had a 33% chance of it. It's Proverbs. Okay, so and this is a passage in Proverbs that's only read on the Annunciation, March 25th. Okay, and I bring it up for talk about where we can go wrong. So it's Proverbs, depending on which translation you read. It's either Proverbs 8:23 through 31 or Proverbs 8:22 through 30. And this is one example where the Greek translation helped certain people make a mess of things, as opposed to. And so I'm going to read it to you, because I'm not saying this in a condescending way. I'm sure no one's familiar with it. So I'll read you the Greek version. The Lord created me in the beginning of his ways for his works. He established me in the beginning before time. Before he made the earth and before he made the abysses, before the going forth of the fountain of waters, before the mountains were created, he begot me before all hills. The Lord made the fields and the uninhabited places and the inhabited heights under heaven. When he prepared heaven, I was present with him. And when he set apart his throne upon the winds, when he made strong the things above the clouds, and made sure the fountains under heaven, and made the strong foundation of the earth, I was working beside him. I was he in whom he rejoiced. Daily and continually I was gladdened by his face. So if you look up in Proverbs, some Bibles, I think the Orthodox Study Bible is one of them, will say this is a passage about the foundational wisdom, the personified wisdom through whom the world was created, the Logos, right? So, but here's where I went kind of wrong. This is an example where we got to be careful of the English, okay? Because it says, from my notes, he created me in the beginning of his works, whereas in the Masoretic, the Hebrew, the Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way. And so, does anybody know what heretic used this passage to justify that Christ was a created being? Arius, right? This is what Arius was pointing to, right? Basically, was saying, they were disrupting the truth as we understood it of the Holy Trinity. I think this was the first council. If memory serves, because I think I remember reading this and I thought that's just cool. I think St. Nicholas got up and smacked Arius. When I first encountered that, being from the Philly, I was like, all right, he got what was coming to him, But St. Nicholas was condemned for doing that. It's kind of a bummer, right? To some extent. But St. Athanasius translated this passage, constituted me as the head of creation. But you see, this is where we see other parts of the Bible talking about the creation story, and that how in the English we can mess it up. So that brand new to everybody, that whole passage in Proverbs.
Translations are always difficult.
Well, they're difficult because their foundations are in the Gospels themselves are immediately translations, because they're speaking in Arabic or whatever for the Aramaic. Sorry, thank you. Yeah, Aramaic, and they're writing in Greek. So in their minds, they're already interpreting, right? And this is why language, and I know I'm harping on this a bit today, but this is why language is so important. And it's really important for us to never just take the language on the surface and say, oh, I get it. Because anybody can say, look, the Bible says it right there, see? I mean, but this talk about Christ in the Old Testament and Theophanies, which we're not really going to get to too much. Already this whole thread of everything being created in and through Christ is fully present. And so that's why, again, whatever parts of the Bible we choose to read, the Old Testament, it's always through the lens of Christ. And then you brought up Psalms, and of course, those are the prayers of the church. And even though we're not reading them during the weekday, during Lent, all the Psalms, if you look, like for instance, the Orthodox Study Bible, if you look at the Psalms, all the notes in the Psalms, all the scholars that chose to write the notes are always talking about that Psalm in the context of Christ. Every single one of them. So, okay, so the remaining few minutes we have, let me, I guess, set up for next week. Let me tie this a little bit to Theophany. Well, maybe not. Sorry, my mind's going a couple of different directions. I'm trying to think is this a good stopping point? Well, let me just say this. So getting back to this, the beginning. We talked last week about how our understanding of creation inverts a lot of the pagan stories. So, do you remember? John writes his passages. In the beginning was the Word. It's a very, very calm presentation of what was going on. Same with Genesis, right? God's Spirit was hovering over the face of the deep. Do you remember you guys know what water symbolizes in the Bible? Rough waters.
Rough ones.
Yeah, waters. Yeah, in general, it's seen as there's a reason why the author of Genesis is portraying the calmness of God's Spirit hovering over the face of the deep. Where if you read Genesis, everything's in His effortless control, right? Anybody know why? And obviously, waters somewhat relates to when we get the theophany because Christ came up out of the water, but chaos, death, right? That the raging seas. Okay, so that's why it's really important. And a lot of the creation stories were I won't get into them all because it's just, but a lot of the pagan creation stories were about. Hey, Daniel, good morning. Were about raging seas being subdued. So where in the Gospels do we see stories about raging waters?
Christ.
Right.
In the lake, the sea. Yeah.
Right.
And he calmed the seas, and they were astonished. Right.
Yeah. This is why they were so. I mean, anybody would be marveled if they see someone calm the seas, but they understood this. This was in their psyche, if you will, right? This is what they lived. This understanding. I mean, today you could say, we live, I don't know, political or technical. There's some framework of our understanding of that which we tend to anchor our reality to. A lot of us, right? But we as Christians, this is important because when Christ calmed the waters or walked on the waters, it was a complete manifestation of I am. We talked about last week, right? Tying it back, and that's why we have the whole symbolism of death through water, baptism, sharing in the death of Christ, because this is what water meant. But God.
Well, I'm going to state the obvious, Michael, but we're not Second Temple Jews,
Right.
So we don't think the way Second Temple Jews did at the time of Christ. So
Right.
if they're living what we call the Old Testament today as their scripture, and they're imbued with this is how they've grown up all of their lives, these Judaic communities
Right.
that Christ taught to, it makes perfect sense. It's just that, and I'll just speak for myself, I didn't really have a fundamental understanding of the Old Testament as sort of the segue to Christ and the Christian way. It was the Jewish Bible,
Right.
them, and Christ, us.
Right. But that, I would argue,
Yeah.
is what we need to come back and understand how the
yeah.
Second Temple,
Yeah.
because it's we're so far removed from
Right.
that, and that one of the things that can lead to our own misunderstanding is because we dismiss the Old Testament as that's the Old Testament God, the God of violence, the God of this, the God of that, and it takes away from the fullness of our understanding. So that's the connection that we're trying to make, but it's hard. I mean, I found it I probably still do, but it's hard when you finally start realizing this to get it past here into here, because it is antithetical to how we understand things a lot, right? A lot of our, a lot of the ways we're taught certain stories or whatnot, and we realize that's not really how they understood it.
I was thinking of two things. One is there's a part in the Bible where they're in a boat. Jesus is kind of sleeping, and it's raging seas, right?
Mhm.
And they're all like getting really upset. And he wakes up, and he gets into this thing about faith and calms the waters. The other one is Jonah. Like I was just thinking of that, right? God wants to send him to Nineveh. He's going the other direction, and throw him overboard. Then all of a sudden the seas calm down. Maybe.
And Jonah died.
What?
Jonah died. It seems like Jonah never died, but he was dead in the belly of the whale. That's what people, so.
Was it?
Yeah, that's our understanding of that. Yeah. Well, at least the myriad scholars that I've researched, that's their understanding. If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. But yeah, but it's important because there's a lot of reasons it's important. But when you remember, Christ said this generation demands signs, but the only sign you're going to be given is the sign of Jonah. Right? Think about that. So the entire truth of the New Testament is based on something that we, in our modernity, would say, oh, that's a metaphorical story, therefore lesser in truth because it's metaphorical. It's not factually correct, maybe. It can't possibly happen. How can you be dead three days in the belly of a fish and be alive again. It's metaphorical, but that's the foundational truth. That's what Christ could have picked all kinds of stuff. This is what he points to. Yeah, if you really think about it that way, it's kind of like, wow. It makes us, it takes us to a place, Second Temple of Judaism takes to that place where we have to put on that mind and that mindset of metaphorical, poetic things that don't come natural to us. Well, not all of us, but societally, our culture is not geared towards that. It's more pragmatic effectiveness and efficiency and value of things for being things and things like that, not necessarily conducive to opening up our noetic understanding of things. So, anyway, okay, I guess that's a good place to stop. I hope that was helpful for everybody. Again, apologize for the difficulties. The good news is if people watch this all the way through, as usual, it's probably my fault for over preparing. We didn't get to all the material that I built, so you didn't really miss a lot if you plan to join next week. But anyway, have a wonderful week. God bless everyone. And we will be back. I forget, it's in October, the first week of October, next Sunday. Take care.